The Gateway brings you the day's news each weekday from around the St. Louis region and the state capitals in Jefferson City.
Our schools are accredited. We don't need this bill.
And Springfield.
How many more years must pass before lawmakers see time is of the essence?
I'm Abby Larico. Join me each weekday for The Gateway on the STLPR app or wherever you get podcasts.
From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the show, we'll talk with Missouri Congressman Mark Alford about his recent trip to Taiwan and why he backed aid for Israel but opposed military assistance for Ukraine. We'll also hear from a representative of a ballot initiative to raise Missouri's minimum wage and establish paid sick leave for workers. But first, a new state report revealed a startling revelation about Missouri's child welfare system. Children's Division investigators tasked with looking into accusations of abuse and neglect failed to heed warning signs that parents were taking fentanyl before those parents' children died of accidental overdoses. This finding is raising sharp questions about the management of the Children's Division, an agency that's faced daunting challenges in retaining and recruiting people to look into child abuse accusations. And it's prompting calls for the legislature and the governor's office to change how these investigators are trained, overseen, and paid. Joining us now is one of the people who helped put this report together, Jessica Seitz. Seitz is the executive director of the Missouri Network Against Child Abuse. Jessica, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me here today.
This report stated that Children's Division investigators, quote, lacked essential procedures, missed warning signs, and left vulnerable children at risk. Can you provide me some specifics about how investigators missed warning signs that parents of children who died of fentanyl overdoses were taking fentanyl?
Sure. We did a comprehensive review of all the fentanyl-related fatalities on this committee.
In 2022.
In 2022, yes. All 2022 fentanyl-related fatalities of children. And yes, we found multiple cases where warning signs were missed that a child was still in danger at their home, and it led to a fatality. So we found there were cases, so specifically I'm going to talk about the cases when I'm referring to cases of the young children, but where there were clear drug problems including at birth, where mom or child tested positive at the hospital, and they were home, and then there was ongoing evidence that drug treatment, that there was no cooperation, the drug treatment was not successful, yet children remained in these unsafe situations.
I mean, I'm going to be very candid with you. These types of findings are stunning to me. And I spoke with Emily Van Schenkoff of the Missouri Children's Trust Fund and asked her point blank if she was shocked by what she found.
It was really hard to see. But I would say I have been working in child welfare for close to 15 years in the state of Missouri now. And so I understand a lot of the complexities about why these things happen in a different way than other people do. But yes, I would say there was a strong emotional reaction on my part to reading these cases and to seeing how they were investigated.
That was Emily Van Schenkoff with the Missouri Children's Trust Fund. Did these findings shock you as well?
Yes. My reaction mirrors Emily's. Both of us have been advocates on policies related to child abuse and neglect prevention and response, have reviewed alarming cases, but yet this group of cases was very alarming and shocking. I was shocked by the severity of these cases, and that led to the fatalities.
So the big question that I think all of us are asking who have read this report is, why do you think the investigators didn't immediately try and get a child out of a home if they had evidence that a parent was consuming fentanyl?
I think So there were two things that happened, and we can go into more specific recommendations. I'm happy to go into all of them, but there was safety was not properly assessed, understood the level of danger that these children were in at their home. That could be due to lack of training and the lack of using safety assessments, risk assessments. So, and then that tools that do exist to support safety were not properly or not employed at all.
Yeah, I mean, I have learned a lot about how investigators react to child abuse claims in the last few months, and we'll get to this in a little bit, but if an investigator finds that a child is in imminent danger, they're supposed to call law enforcement, and they're supposed to react to that as if, like, you know, they're supposed to react to that very quickly. But it doesn't seem like, at least in 2022, finding fentanyl or finding evidence of fentanyl use rose to that level of alarm. Is that what you found out as well?
Yes. I mean, I can reinforce over and over that Children's Division isn't the only party responsible for child safety in our state. Law enforcement, the juvenile office, which we'll discuss later, there are multiple disciplines of a multidisciplinary team responsible for investigating child abuse, but those parties have to be engaged and involved.
Well, let's talk about juvenile officers. Missouri has an unusual system where Children's Division investigators do not have the power to just take kids and put them into foster care. They have to gather evidence, present it to a juvenile officer, and they're employed by the courts, and then they get the process rolling to get a judge to order removal. But it really seems like the communication between Children's Division and juvenile officers has been very fraught for a long time. Can you talk about that?
Yes, very fraught, and consequences of that were seen in these cases and in this report. Yes, Missouri has a unique system. In other states, their Children's Division or their Child Protective Services, whatever it may be called, has a direct link to the court. In Missouri, we have another party called the Juvenile Office that is our link to the court. So if you want court involvement or oversight, which are very important tools in, holding families accountable for keeping kids safe, you do have to have that partnership and that communication to the juvenile office.
Well, there's another tool called temporary alternative placement agreements, and that's a formalized agreement where a child could be placed in a different home while a parent goes to, say, a drug treatment program. But from talking with you before, it doesn't seem like that tool has been utilized nearly enough, especially when it comes to fentanyl cases.
Absolutely. So there's a story to where TAPAs came from. Again, temporary alternative placement agreement. Long name, but it's very descriptive. The story is that, so concerns over safety not being properly assessed and is not new. And there was a task force on child safety that convened in 2019 that led to recommendations. Lawmakers responded to that and passed TAPAs. And what they are is they're voluntary. A child is not put into foster care and is not involved in the court system yet. A child that is placed temporarily in the home of a relative, and then a notification, however, just to throw this out there, a notification to the juvenile office that a TOP has been put in place does happen. So the case, they're not formally involved, but they are notified. Because they are voluntary, if a family is not cooperative with the provisions of a TAPA, the court can be notified.
I was just going to ask that because it seems like that is a very well-meaning policy, but if parents are not willing to enter into it, or they say, I don't have a drug problem, and I'm not going to let you take my kid and give it to like my parents or an uncle, it falls apart.
Yes, a TAPA is only as good as it is in its development, the plans, the solutions, and the implementation, and the cooperation. It's a partnership between the Children's Division and a family. And if there's a lack of cooperation, then referral can and should be made to the court to discuss next steps.
We are talking with Jessica Seitz, the executive director of the Missouri Network Against Child Abuse, on this new report about child fentanyl deaths. So It's no secret that the Children's Division has had a lot of trouble retaining and recruiting investigators, especially in places like St. Louis, where there still is a pretty sizable backlog, though I think it has gone down. Do you think that part of the issue here is that investigators were so overworked and were so overwhelmed with cases that they just were not paying the proper attention to whether parents were taking fentanyl and the child needed to be removed from the home?
I think that's certainly part of it. Our Children's Division has just been overwhelmed, and they have an incredibly difficult job. And child welfare investigations are complicated. They're not easily solved with a conversation and an agreement where you leave. And they require, multiple conversations, interventions with a family, potentially others, that have contact with children. And it's hard to give that level of attention to detail when you have such a huge caseload.
I ask this because Children's Division Director Daryl Missy has openly said that the staffing troubles at his agency prompted investigators to prioritize accusations of abuse or neglect where a child is in imminent danger. Here's Missy talking with me last year about that topic.
So they're investigating abuse and neglect is defined so broadly that you could drive a truck through it. So a lot of times those things come down to issues of poverty. But so you have allegations of physical and sexual abuse, which are our most serious things, and then you have neglect, which is are most of the cases, and those are normally fueled by addiction, mental illness, and poverty. And so you have some triage going on, obviously, because you've got things that are crimes and are emergent. You put on the front burner. And then, the dirty house case, the educational neglect case, those things may take some more time because you're not thinking somebody's going to be harmed today because of that.
That is Children's Division Director Daryl Missy talking with me last year. I'm going to ask you point blank, do you think that this report showcases the consequences of the triaging that Missy was talking about?
Yes. I understand what the director was saying with that statement, especially in the conversation that you were having. But I believe the quote about neglect is a dangerous generalization of the term neglect. These cases that we reviewed were neglect cases. It is a fact. A majority of reports and cases in the Children's Division are neglect. Where we may not be on the same page and where I have concerns, essentially, definitely based on my work with this committee, is how and when neglect is being triaged. There are cases of neglect that are not abuse, where mental health or substance abuse are involved, that place children in imminent harm. We shouldn't put them aside.
I guess to play devil's advocate, if you are running an agency where you are so chronically understaffed, there's no way that you could say to me or anybody, yes, we're going to get on that neglect case immediately. So, what can be done to prevent this triage from happening? We're going to be talking about some of those solutions, but part of it is you have to hire more people. Mm-hmm. And I think that there has been some improvement in St. Louis, but I think the question is, if they're not well supported, are these people going to stay long term?
If they're not well supported, they're not going to stay. I think that we've already.
I think I answered my own question there, but continue.
Yes, I mean, I've said over and over, and that these cases are complicated, which again requires investigation, multiple points of conversation, and meetings with families, which are best done if there's a consistent caseworker, right? If workers are retained, but they need to be supported. They're not simple, but in some of these cases, the assessment of safety and risk that wasn't done timely, could have been done immediately, and with the support of that workers, it's not just on the worker, that individual caseworker, with their support of their supervisor, which is required. A 72-hour consultation with your supervisor to discuss risk is supposed to happen.
Yeah, and let's talk about solutions. And accountability was one of the things I wanted to talk about. I have a lot of sympathy for these investigators. As we'll get to in a minute, they're overworked, they are ridiculously underpaid, and they encounter some of the worst situations that a person can encounter. But I just have to say, if they had evidence that a parent was taking fentanyl and they didn't do everything they could to get the kid out of the house, how do you have accountability without being so harsh against these investigators that they quit? What does accountability look like here?
Accountability looks like using the tools that you have in your toolbox. So accountability is utilizing risk assessments to identify those most at risk, which when I said with neglect, fentanyl, the presence of fentanyl, based on what we know about its lethality and level of danger, fentanyl should have put these cases at the top of the pile. And so assessing safety must be a priority, the top priority. And this goes for all investigations, not just fentanyl. I also think you asked about accountability. A huge component of accountability is the courts, the use of the courts and that juvenile officer, a referral. And I don't believe that's being done.
One of the things I was talking about with Emily Van Schenkoff is just the lack of training about what to do when you encounter evidence of fentanyl. And one of the things that she specifically said is that since COVID, a lot of training has been online and not in person. That clearly needs to change, correct?
Yes, absolutely. Training is a key recommendation in almost every task force and every group that I've ever been a part of. When we look at improving our system, training is a recommendation. The move for trainings to be done virtually is problematic. I think that you can gain a lot from in-person trainings among your peers with those other parties also working in partnership. Juvenile officers, they can do training with Children's Division. I think you can't replace that with a virtual training. That collaboration, that engagement, and ability to ask questions and get answers.
Now, you mentioned tools in the toolbox. Are the right tools in the toolbox? Is there anything that needs to be added by the legislature or that can be done administratively that we haven't talked about?
And I'll reiterate that we have to use the ones we have properly.
Fair enough, but continue.
Okay. Yes, and there's some mention of that in the report. I think we have to continue working, but I think that there were solutions kicked around about if we're specifically talking about fentanyl, presence of fentanyl at the time of at the hospital when a newborn or referral notification to the juvenile office. That's an option. That's an option worth exploring, and I think discussing with lawmakers about that, and with juvenile office about what that would look like.
Now, the other thing that looms large over all of this is pay for these investigators. I don't mean to keep being a broken record about this, but the idea that we are going to get people to investigate some of the worst crimes against children and the starting salary is $43,000 a year, it's not going to happen. Mm-hmm. It is just not going to happen, especially when there are other jobs in the private sector that pay more and have a workload that's not unmanageable. But the legislature right now is only planning on boosting the starting salary by 3.2%. I've asked Governor Parson about this. He does not really want to go above that if the raises are not standardized. But how do we get the governor and the legislature to realize that the pay is a pressing problem that needs immediate action?
Well,
beyond doing the show, obviously.
We have to keep raising awareness. It's not unprecedented that the legislature has tried to push for increased pay for Children's Division workers. They've put it in the budget in the past, raised Children's Division. The House Budget Committee did it several years ago, and it was taken out, with the idea that, wait, before we raise one part of our state, let's look at the salaries of all state employees. And there's been a reluctance to explore the solution of specifically targeting increased pay for Children's Division. And it's problematic. We spoke earlier, we referenced it several times, just how important this job is, just how strapped they are. We talked about training. Training is heavy. I mean, that's a lot of on-the-job foundational and continuing training. That's a lot of work in addition to your daily responsibilities. Highly skilled. You have to be highly skilled in this. That's a lot to ask of an individual. That's a lot to ask of an individual with that level of pay.
And I guess I just have to ask this more generally, because this is something that I have been thinking about since I really started covering this issue last year with a lot of intentionality and a lot of energy. There are a lot of people like you who have been raising the alarm about Children's Division for years, and there are a dedicated group of bipartisan legislators who really want to tackle this complex and troubled agency. But it just does not seem that the vigor is shared by other policymakers in the executive and legislative branch. How can we get this to change? How do we get this to be on the front burner of Missouri policy and political discourse?
I think this show's a great start. I would say that covering a child welfare-related topic on this show is not that. I mean, this is an excellent platform. I think that we've certainly had some great leaders and bipartisanship on these issues, and I think that we took a deep dive. This was at the request of the administration to have this subcommittee, making sure that this report and these recommendations the awareness is raised about them, about the issue, about the solutions, potential solutions. All of that must be continued. We can't let this sit on the shelf. We can't let a report sit on the shelf and not explore. And so I hope to have it in hand when I'm working with lawmakers next year. I mean, we're only a couple of weeks left here, but I hope to have it in hand. I've already started the discussion with some legislators, some advocates, kind of behind the scenes saying, what can we look at? Is this statutory? Is this not? But I think continuing to raise awareness that safety has to be a priority. Our current laws or practices are not going far enough. What can we do? What can we do? And that we've got to keep child welfare among the top.
Jessica Seitz is the executive director of the Missouri Network Against Child Abuse. She was one of many people who put together a report about child fentanyl deaths in Missouri. Jessica, thank you so much for joining with me today.
I appreciate you having me.
When we come back, we'll talk with Congressman Mark Alford about his recent trip to Taiwan. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. It's been more than a week since Congress finished up work on a massive foreign aid package that includes assistance to Ukraine, Israel, and Taiwan. While there's been a lot of attention on opposition to provide military aid to Ukraine and Israel, the Taiwanese package arguably flew under the radar, even though backers of the idea say it could be vital to blunting any potential Chinese invasion of the island. Missouri Congressman Mark Alford just recently returned from a trip to Taiwan. The Republican represents the state's 4th congressional district, which takes in a swath of central and western Missouri and includes Fort Leonard Wood in Pulaski County. Alford joins us now from Washington, D.C. Congressman, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Jason, thank you for having me.
What was your biggest takeaway from your trip to Taiwan last week?
Wow, what a beautiful country Taiwan is. I know we don't officially recognize them as a nation, but they are very independent-minded people, a beautiful island that needs our help. They need our help in deterring the communist Chinese from further aggression. Xi Jinping is determined to take over Taiwan. And if you look at the timeline that he's been operating on, he's pretty much compressed what he wanted to do maybe by 2035 in taking Taiwan. And some of our generals are saying that the timeline now could be moved up to 2027. That's only 3 years away. And Taiwan desperately needs, under the Taiwan Relations Act that now is 45 years old with the United States, this agreement that sets up that we will help them in their capacity for self-defense. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that we will go over and defend them, but we are helping them, supplying them with the armaments they need, and that's what this package was, $8.1 billion to help them. The problem is, Jason, is that they have already bought a lot of armaments that we have not been able to get to them in time. They are due 64 F-16 jets by 2026. Those are not there. 400 Harpoon missiles built there in the St. Louis area, the Harpoon missile is, and those have not gotten to the people there. The greatest deterrent against Communist China and Xi Jinping and his continued aggression is going to be able to have the armaments in place to be a deterrent, and that needs to happen as soon as possible.
You mentioned this, but I think one of the confounding things about the U.S.-Taiwanese relationship is they're in this limbo area where they pretty much act as an independent country, but America does not consider themselves a country. And I've done some research on this. There's some real disagreement within Taiwan about declaring independence or remaining in this limbo status quo. Do you think that the infusion of aid provides the connotation to China that we see Taiwan as an independent country, and that could exacerbate tensions?
Well, I think that's always a possibility, but I am tired of the way that this administration and this president, his appeasement to Communist China at the same time that we were over meeting with President Tsai and Vice President Lai, who's going to be the next president on May 19th. Antony Blinken was over meeting with Xi Jinping, cozying up to him. And I am determined that we show strength with Taiwan in helping them elevate their position on the world stage to fight against the coercion, economic and social coercion by Xi Jinping. He is trying to isolate them. Now, I realize that we are living under the one China policy. In 1979, our government policy has been to follow what we refer to as the one China policy. But we do have key provisions of the Taiwan Relations Act, which include making available to Taiwan the defense articles and services that they need to maintain a sufficient self-defense capability. That's what we've agreed to, and we need to live up to that capability no matter what lies down the road. It's the same as President Reagan said, peace through strength.
One of the arguments you've heard from people who oppose Ukraine funding, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a few minutes, is that there's no amount of money that could be spent to help Ukraine push Russia out of its borders. So couldn't you make the same argument that there's really no amount of money that we could provide Taiwan that would prevent a country that is literally 60 times larger than them in population from overtaking their territory?
Well, yes, if you look at it from just the standpoint of supplying Taiwan with the armaments and the money that they need to deter China, but they are not in this alone. Australia is on our team. We are on the side of the Taiwanese. Part of the provisions under the TRA is that we have to as well maintain our capacity to resist any resort to force or other forms of coercion that the Communist Chinese would put up. And so we have a responsibility as well. That's why we have the B-2 stealth bomber. That's why we're building the B-21 stealth bomber, the Raider. And that's going to be a wonderful deterrent. That's why there are other platforms that are being built right now in the defense industry space that are going to help in our deterrence of Communist China. Communist China has its tentacles in everything we do in the United States, and they're not going to stop at Taiwan. They're building investments through the Belt and Road Initiative in our hemisphere. They're intent on having an influence there, building ports, airports, seaports, roadways, bridges, to where they can exert pressure on these nations and supplant us as a leading economic and world power.
One of the things you've heard, including from people like former President Trump, is that any aid to Ukraine should be a loan. But we haven't heard similar types of arguments when we're talking about aid to Israel or Taiwan. And Taiwan is like a top 20 economy in the country. They clearly could afford the $8 billion worth of military aid that we're giving them. Why should it be like a grant, essentially, and not a loan?
Well, for the simple reason, one of the reasons is, I believe, is that 65% of the world's goods are transported through the Straits of Taiwan and the South China Sea. If and when we do have a conflict with China, or China decides to set up a blockade around Taiwan, which is a very real possibility, even right now, every day, the Communist Chinese are crossing the median line in the Taiwan Strait, trying to provoke the Taiwanese. If it does come to a war, a conflict, it is going to be a sea battle. It will shut down the traffic in the Straits of Taiwan, and it will lead to a greater depression than we saw in the 1920s and 30s. It will make COVID look like a cakewalk. 5% of the goods that you now see on the store shelves are going to be there. We don't need it to happen. We need to protect Taiwan, but we also need to protect our economic interests. Israel is a different story. They are a leader, a beacon of hope and freedom and democracy in the Mideast. I believe that they are God's chosen people, that this is their land. They are willing to live in harmony if those other people who are in that land are willing to live alongside them as well. But that has been the issue. They do not want Israel to be there. They do not want the state of Israel to exist. Their Iron Dome is becoming depleted, and David's Sling and the Arrow Project, which is in a higher altitude, that are defending Israel, Tel Aviv, Jerusalem, and that's why it's important that we resupply them. Ukraine is a totally different story, and I just questioned the Secretary of Defense not more than an hour ago about this very issue. He was testifying before our Armed Services Committee. I asked him, Mr. Secretary, what does victory look like in Ukraine? The previous Congress has appropriated and authorized $113 billion, $67 billion of that for direct military assistance. This president slow-rolled out the aids, the F-16s, the attack of missiles, the Abrams tanks. This war could have been over a long time ago had President Biden not dragged his heels.
Well, let's get to...
I cannot get a clear definition of what victory looks like, and that is the problem. Taxpayers should not be continuing to fund this mission until we know what victory is defined as.
So let's go to Israel and Ukraine. I'll start with Israel. So you voted for an aid package to help Israel in its war in Gaza. But there was one person from the Missouri delegation, Congresswoman Cori Bush, who voted against that measure. Here's what she had to say last week to reporters in St. Louis.
I voted no on the Israeli military funding because we don't want our tax dollars going to anywhere that's going to bomb children and to bomb, innocent people. The Gaza has been just devastated, absolutely devastated. The people are, and there's a famine happening right now, and this is at the hands of the United States government. And so I voted against that because absolutely in no way, we could be 34,000 more Palestinians alive right now instead of 34,000 dead with many under rubble.
That is Congresswoman Cori Bush. She represents Missouri's 1st congressional district. In addition to responding to the Congresswoman, why should America continue to fund Israel's military invasion of Gaza if they can't guarantee the safety of civilians there?
Hamas and the Islamic terrorists, the jihadists around the world, look at Israel as the little Satan and the United States of America as the great Satan. This is not going to stop with Israel. We were over there 4 weeks ago, and we met with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and he told me, if you do not prepare to fight for civilization, you will go under. You will be overcome. That is what they are facing right now. Imagine, Jason, that you are living in a house there in St. Louis, and the person across the street, the person to the right, the house to the left, and the house behind you, everyone not just doesn't want you in their neighborhood, they want you dead. That is what Israel is looking like. When it comes to Gaza and the way that the IDF has prosecuted this war, keep in mind of the thousands of people, almost 2,000, who were murdered, who were butchered. We went to these kibbutzes, mothers raped. We were in these kibbutzes. There are 133 innocent hostages now being held in Gaza. I believe 8 of those are U.S. citizens, including Hirsch Goldberg. We met with their families. In war, innocent people do die. I believe that the IDF has taken every step possible to try to minimize that. But now they're left with the option of going in and finishing off Hamas. They've killed or captured, I believe, 18 of the 24 remaining battalions there, and they have to finish the job. They have to annihilate Hamas and free the hostages.
How do you do that without creating another Hamas? We kind of have seen like efforts to try and, quote, eradicate terrorism when America's doing that, and it's sort of like whack-a-mole almost. Is this idea that the IDF can totally dismantle and eradicate this antagonism among Palestinians really a realistic goal if many Palestinians see Israelis as occupiers and invaders?
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? A lot of talk is about having a two-state solution. Israel early on was for a two-state solution, but the PLO did not agree to it. They could not get the consensus among the Islamic community surrounding Israel, and so they don't have a two-state solution. I think, and I heard this from President Herzog, they would love to live in peace and harmony with the rest of the people there in the Mideast. That's not happening. Saudi Arabia was about to sign on to this agreement, and that is one of the reasons that Hamas on October 7th did what they did, to invade Israel, to kill its citizens and capture citizens and hold them hostage. And so, I don't think you're ever going to completely eliminate Islamic terrorism and that corrupted ideology. But a good start is to eliminate those fighters and those terrorists who are carrying out the mission of that.
Do you believe a two-state solution is possible?
Well, you can't have a two-state solution with terrorists involved, and that's been the problem. Israel, they had a ceasefire until October 7th. And so, no, you're not going to be able to have a two-state solution when one of those states is a terrorist state.
Moving on to Ukraine, you said that you want to see what victory looks like in Ukraine before authorizing any more money for that country. But we saw after the United States froze aid because of the impasse in Congress that they were losing ground pretty quickly. So doesn't that show that giving them nothing will ultimately result in them losing the war to Russia? In other words, is doing nothing a guarantee that you won't know what victory looks like because there will not be victory?
I just think that the people of Missouri, the taxpayers of Missouri and the 4th Congressional District, the 772,047 people I represent anyway, deserve an answer. We cannot be in another long, extracted conflict like we were in Afghanistan, like we were in Vietnam, with an unlimited budget to prosecute this war and try to push Putin back to pre-1991 borders. Zelensky will not tell us what victory looks like. Does it mean taking back Crimea, the Donbass region, going back to the pre-1991 borders? He will not tell us. I cannot get the answers in an open setting or closed setting. And our taxpayers deserve to know the answer. How long are we going to be in this for? How much is it going to cost us? The other argument, Jason, is that if we cannot secure our own border, our border with Mexico, when our own people are being killed, 107,000 a year from fentanyl poisoning, why are we spending money to secure the Ukrainian border? My people in the district ask that. I think it's a very good question.
My last question for you, and you've heard this from other supporters of Ukraine aid. If Ukraine ends up being completely annexed or the puppet government is put in, and then Russia turns to the Baltics or Poland, which are NATO allies, couldn't you make an argument that helping Ukraine push Russia out of its country as much as possible and maintain a friendly government to the West is a preventative measure from World War III? Because if any of those things happens, like Russia invading the Baltics or Poland, Article 5 comes into play and we're suddenly at war with Russia.
Yes, I see that. And I know that Putin has not just telegraphed that intent, but has said it publicly, that he will not stop with Ukraine. This guy's crazy. He is a power-hungry, maniacal dictator who has disguised himself as a president. That is very well understood. But I also understand that we cannot continue with few to any answers as to what victory looks like. I think this is what this is going to come down to, Jason, is what Zelensky does not want to admit right now, is that they're going to have to start talking. There's going to have to be some talks about how do we end this war. And I don't think it's going to happen while Biden is still in office. I think when President Trump gets back in the Oval Office, I think this thing will be over within a week.
Well, he has to win that election first, so that may be a bit presumptuous, but you never know. That's why people vote in November. Congressman Mark Alford is the representative of Missouri's 4th Congressional District. Congressman, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jason. Always a pleasure.
When we come back, we'll talk about an effort to raise the minimum wage and establish paid earned sick time in Missouri. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. You could say that this week has been a busy and productive time for groups seeking to place initiative petitions on the ballot. They started turning in signatures this week, and while much of the focus has been on efforts to legalize abortion and sports betting, there's another measure to raise the minimum wage that also turned in signatures in Jefferson City, and it would also establish earned paid sick leave. And so far, it seems like they are primed to appear before Missourians this year. Here to talk about what's in this initiative is Richard von Glahn, the campaign manager with Missourians for Healthy Families and Fair Wages. Richard, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thanks for having me, Jason.
So there's two parts of this initiative, and we'll split them in half. Raising the minimum wage and establishing earned paid sick time. How would the minimum wage increase part work?
The minimum wage would gradually increase. It would go up to $13.75 by January 1st of 2025, and then $15 an hour the following year, January 1st of 2026. It would then be indexed to inflation, so it would go up every year at the rate of inflation, which has been the standard for Missouri minimum wage since 2006.
And for context, what is currently the minimum wage in Missouri?
The current minimum wage is just $12.30 an hour. What that means for a full-time worker working at that 40 hours a week, you earn just $492 a week, which is not considered a living wage in any county in the state of Missouri.
As for the paid sick leave part, how would that work? And I think more importantly, what would be in place in this initiative to make sure that businesses that are affected by it actually follow through and do it?
Yeah. So currently, Missouri does not have any law guaranteeing anyone any paid time off. And so the result is estimates have over 700,000 Missourians do not have access to a single minute of paid time off. And we don't think anyone should ever really have to choose between their paycheck and taking care of their own health or their family's health. But when you don't have paid time off, a lot of times you have to do that because if you can't afford to miss a day of work, otherwise you might miss a utility bill at the end of the month or not be able to keep gas in the car, you have to make those difficult choices. And so we really want to change that for Missouri families. What it would allow workers to do is you would earn paid sick leave that you could use to care for yourself or your family, and you would earn it at the rate of 1 hour for every 30 hours that you work. So that formula is the same whether you're a full-time worker or a part-time worker. Obviously, you'd earn it more if you're working more hours, but that's the way that you would earn this benefit.
And that's the floor. if companies want to do more than that, there's nothing in that says they can't offer more generous sick leave.
Absolutely. And some companies we know already do that, but there are a number that don't.
Would there be penalties for companies that do not comply if this ends up passing?
We don't have what we find in doing issues like the minimum wage that we've done before is, 98% of employers are going to do the right thing, and there's actually the earned sick leave phases in a little bit after the election. It's not, this passes in November and January 1st, all of a sudden you have to be able to do it. So there's a little bit of time built in for companies to learn about the law and be prepared to follow the law. So we're not looking to punish people, but we're really looking to make sure employees have this right and are able to exercise it.
So this is a statutory change, not a constitutional amendment, meaning that hypothetically, if this passes, the legislature could come back in 2025 and just poof, repeal the whole thing. That did not happen, though, with the minimum wage increases in 2006 and 2018. Is there confidence that the legislature will let this go if it ends up passing?
I mean, what we typically see in these campaigns is that there is broad support across the political spectrum, across geographies. And so while legally the legislature could come back, what they would be doing is often overturning the vote of their own constituents. And so while they in theory could do that, we feel very confident that that they will respect people's voices.
We got a couple of questions from social media about this measure. Derek N. on Twitter, I guess that's the former name of the social media platform, which is now called, quote, X. I thought petitions had to be a single subject. Are the organizers concerned that they may face litigation over this?
No, I mean, this is really paid sick leave and minimum wage go hand in hand. It's part of the compensation package that employees would receive. I actually listened to a program this morning, a radio program that was done by Steve Kraske over in Kansas City, where a worker there, a restaurant worker, Marietta Ortiz, spoke about this and how, when she misses work because she doesn't have access to paid sick leave and her wages are so low, it means that she's not going to be able to afford a utility bill. And she talked about the pain of her children sort of not understanding why that was happening and feeling like a bad mother. And we don't want any worker or any parent to ever have to feel that way. And that's how we see these two things are really part of the total compensation package that workers receive.
Black Sunshine Rodriguez on Reddit asks, do people think that this is a reasonable amount to ask for? It seems a little low. And I think that's in reference to starting at $13.75 an hour and going to $15 an hour. I guess it seems low because the labor market has changed so dramatically since 2018. And a lot of companies are offering pretty aggressive salaries that may be more than $13.75 an hour.
Yeah, what we've seen is there's over 500,000 Missourians that unfortunately still make under $15 an hour. So I understand that sentiment, and we always want to encourage businesses. We think it's important that workers be recognized for the value that their labor produces and compensated fairly for that. But this is a phase-in and a step that we think raises the floor for everybody.
In the last 30 seconds, seems to be a banner year for initiative petitions. Not only did your group get more than enough, it was reported today that efforts to establish abortion rights got 380,000 signatures in 3 months. Why do you think people are so excited about the initiative petition process?
I mean, IPs have been part of the toolkit of Missouri's democracy for 100 years. And I think, people value that process and like to be able to bring issues to a vote with their neighbors.
Richard Von Glahn is the campaign manager for the effort to increase Missouri's minimum wage and established earned paid sick leave. Richard, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jason.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich, and our production intern is Roche Hemmings.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
If you have a smart speaker, you have access to the entire world of NPR and St. Louis Public Radio. All the latest news and all the captivating stories. Activate our voices with yours by telling your smart speaker to play St. Louis Public Radio.